Freedom Summer was the movement in the summer of 1964 where waves of civil rights organizations worked to register as many African Americans from Mississippi for voting as possible.
Please join.
The American Broadcasting Company continues its
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not.
This movement emerged during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, inspired from the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Riders, the sit-ins, the March on Washington, and especially MLK's speech, "I Have a Dream."
Despite these movements sweeping the nation, discrimination was still rampant in the South, especially in the state of Mississippi, where poll taxes and literacy tests were in place to discourage voting for blacks, and extreme racial violence occurred.
With only 7% of Mississippi's eligible black voters registered to vote in 1962, the African American community had no chance of creating political change in favor of civil rights.
The Freedom Summer Project was run by several organizations, primarily the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE.
CORE was founded in 1942 and used sit-ins and other forms of civil disobedience to challenge segregation. The organization partly ran the Freedom Summer Project as well. Along with Bob Moses, Davis Dennis was the leader of CORE's operation in Mississippi and led the participation in the Freedom Summer Project.
The SNCC became the leader of the Council of Federated Organizations, which coordinated all the organizations under the cause for civil rights in the state. This was directed by Bob Moses, who proposed this voter registration drive.
About 1,000 students, mostly white Northerners, became volunteers for this movement. Their job was to, in a peaceful way, encourage and raise awareness to black voter registration.
Organized by the SNCC, CORE, and other civil rights groups, this grassroots campaign aimed to register African American voters and break the strongholds of white supremacy in the Deep South.
Freedom Summer's director, Robert Bob Moses, was committed to sparking change without resorting to violence. To craft an effective strategy, Moses and his fellow organizers drew inspiration from literature such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s memoir, Stride Toward Freedom, and Lillian Smith's Killers of the Dream.
A key tactic of Freedom Summer was the establishment of freedom schools. These alternative schools, often held in churches and private homes, provided African American students with much-needed education in subjects like citizenship, literacy, and black history.
Civil rights groups recruited and trained college students from across the country in nonviolent resistance. These student volunteers, primarily white and roughly one-third female, played a significant role in the voter registration drive.
Over the course of the summer, thousands of student volunteers fanned out across Mississippi, determined to register as many African American voters as possible. They faced tremendous resistance from local authorities, the Ku Klux Klan, and other white supremacist groups. Despite the risks and countless acts of intimidation, the volunteers remained committed to their cause.
In the sweltering summer of 1964, three brave young men, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, set out to investigate a heinous act in Rome, Mississippi. Their mission was to uncover the truth behind the burning of a local African-American church.
Schwerner, a 24-year-old social worker from New York City, Goodman, a 20-year-old college student also hailing from New York, and Chaney, a 21-year-old black Mississippian, all joined forces as part of the Freedom Summer Project.
The disappearance of these three young men sent shockwaves through the project. Volunteers, already facing the really real dangers of their work, found themselves gripped by fear, but their shared commitment to the cause of equality was unyielding.
For 6 agonizing weeks, the nation held its breath, as the search for Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney intensified. Finally, on August 4, 1964, their bodies were recovered, buried in an earthen dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi.
It soon became clear that the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, was responsible for the brutal murders.
The nation was outraged by the brutal killings of Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney. Their tragic deaths became a symbol of the harrowing struggle for civil rights and voting equality in the South. Protests erupted across the country and calls for justice grew louder. As the summer drew to a close, many wondered whether the Freedom Summer had succeeded or failed. It was true that voter registration numbers had not seen a significant increase, with only 1,200 of the 17,000 African Americans who tried to register being accepted. However, the impact of the Freedom Summer extended far beyond these numbers.
One of the most significant achievements of Freedom Summer was the establishment of 40 Freedom Schools, which provided educational opportunities to more than 3,000 African American students. This not only empowered a new generation of young people, but also raised awareness about the importance of education in the fight for civil rights.
The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party also gained prominence during Freedom Summer. The MFDP formed as an alternative to the segregated, undemocratic Mississippi Democratic Party, which supported by civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, King himself called MFDP delegates the true heirs of the tradition of Jefferson and Hamilton.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over that.
While the MFDP was ultimately denied delegate seats at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, the intention and support garnered by the party helped shine a spotlight on the systemic injustice faced by African Americans in Mississippi and across the South.
Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Rooseville, Mississippi. Sunflower County, the home of Senator James.
Some argue that the increased visibility and public outcry resulting from Freedom Summer played a crucial role in President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination.
Ultimately, the voter registration movement was not successful. About 17,000 African Americans attempted to register to vote, however only 1,200 were accepted.
The impact of Freedom Summer can still be felt today. While it may not have achieved all of its goals in terms of voter registration, it undoubtedly raised awareness, empowered communities, and contributed to the broader civil rights movement, setting the stage for future progress in the fight for racial equality in the United States.